welcome to the session here about conducting especially scoping reviews, literature reviews. It's quite exciting for me to present on this topic since I've done a couple of scoping reviews, but it's the first time that I'm actually one of the first times that I'm teaching, so to say, about it, having an online lecture like this, and having the opportunity to reflect on what I've done and trying to communicate that to a larger audience. So that's quite exciting. So I'm trying to share my screen, so I hope that you see my screen, and please let me know if you don't. First of all, thanks to Paul and Chris and Amy for taking the initiative and for supporting me having this online lecture. So thanks to you, and also thanks to my collaborator in UC Leuven, outside Brussels, Belgium, Xavier Dumay, who I collaborated with on a scoping review that I'm going to present in more detail during this lecture. So this is the agenda for the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so before the Q&A. I would like to briefly talk about different types of literature reviews, very briefly. Then I'll go into some depth about a particular scoping review that I have undertaken. And it formed part of the so-called Teachers' Careers Project, which spanned 5 years, based at UC Leuven in Belgium, and it was supported by ERC starting grant. So that's why you have the acknowledgement of the funder here also on this slide. Then I would like to reflect a bit on what does this mean for students? How can scoping reviews be relevant for students in their coursework and also in their dissertation work? And that will hopefully lead to some discussion and debate in the Q&As as well. So the objectives of this session, which is quite short, is to develop knowledge and skills about scoping reviews and how to conduct them. But I think there are some general lessons also about how we conduct literature reviews more generally. And I'm trying to introduce just one example, and there are many, many others. And I would also like to provide some literature references that I think will be very useful for you, whether you are academics or whether you're students, to look further into about scoping reviews and literature reviews more generally. A key point of what I'm going to talk about is really the need for what Martin Hammersley called skilled judgment. You can often get the impression when you look at instructions for conducting literature reviews that it's sort of a checklist with boxes to tick off. And yes, there are procedures, there are stages that are very, very useful and important to think about, but conducting reviews also involves skilled judgment by the researcher, by the student. When you conduct literature reviews, that's absolutely fundamental in my mind to keep in mind when you undertake literature reviews. I would also like, before I actually start getting into the substance, to refer to an earlier talk in this series, very good one, I think, very useful, by my colleague Dustin Husseini on the 20th of November about systematic narrative reviews in qualitative research. I think there are some really useful lessons in that talk about the distinctions between different types of literature reviews, the use of search strategies and databases, important element. But Dustin does not look into scoping reviews. He focuses on other types of reviews. So in this way, our talks complement each other very well, but I very much recommend you to look into this talk as well. Because Dustin is actually saying quite useful things about search strategies in databases, I will not go into much detail in this talk about that issue. So now let's get into the business, the substance of conducting literature reviews. And I think that it's very useful to take a more general view first about what purpose does literature reviews really serve for us as researchers and students. And I totally recommend this article by Mary Kennedy back from 2007, still extremely useful, where she discusses what is really the purpose of different types of literature reviews. And yes, there are different purposes and there are different types of reviews, and that is absolutely fundamental to keep in mind. Again, with keeping in mind the need for skilled judgment by the researcher, by the student. So some reviews will have more of a theoretical focus, mapping literatures, mapping debates in research literatures. Others will have more focus on policy design, policy interventions. What does the literature tell us about which interventions are effective in terms of supporting or pursuing certain policy outcomes? Often the notion of systematic reviews, I mean, that is used a lot among researchers and among students. And it's often being used in a certain way that means that other reviews can seem as, let's say, of less value. And that's important to keep in mind. Again, Mary Kennedy's point that different types of reviews, they serve different purposes. Systematic, aggregative reviews is just one type of many others. So having diversity in mind is crucial. I really like this distinction in a very interesting resource here by Gao, Oliver, and Thomas, where they point out this distinction between aggregative reviews, which can be systematic reviews that try to look for the most effective policy interventions or practice interventions. And then on the other side, so-called configurative reviews, that are more, let's say, have a stronger theoretical interest, trying to map the literature. I think that's a very useful distinction. And there I would then place typically scoping reviews as part of the configurative reviews. I'll come into much more detail about that. So the research field of literature reviews itself is contested. There are many, many different definitions, sometimes overlapping, can be very frustrating for us as readers and as practitioners in research. But here are some pointers about what is a scoping review. There's this article by Arksey and O'Malley. It's cited a lot. It gives a quite useful definition, I think, when they say that scoping reviews serve addressing broader topics, subject to different methodologies. They aim to take stock of a body of literature in terms of its nature, its focus, its extent, or its size, the defining features of that literature, and also the conceptual boundaries towards other issues, other research issues. That is obviously a very broad definition, but I think it's a useful starting point. Certainly it has been for me and the colleagues I've worked with when we have been undertaking scoping reviews. Grant and Booth, 2009. They also provide some pointers that are useful. They point to the preliminary assessment of potential size and scope of available research literature on a certain topic. And again, like Arksey and O'Malley, trying to identify the nature and extent of the research evidence about that topic. Can look at the quantity and the quality of that literature. You can look at the size and you can go into depth discussing what is the quality of this literature, what are the conceptual boundaries, what are the debates, yes, and discussing main areas of dissent and contestation. So these are useful starting points. Before diving into my own example of a scoping review, here are a few other titles that I encourage you, all of you interested in education, I assume, to look into if you are interested in literature reviews, if you're interested in scoping reviews in particular. 3 different scoping reviews with a different focus. But what they have in common is they are looking for patterns in one way or the other in the literature. Some of them can have a more empirical focus, like the first one mentioned here at the top, trying to identify patterns of effects of main public-private partnerships on education. So they're also try to identify patterns in the literature per se, but also the effects in the real world, so to say. Other scoping reviews, including the ones that I've been involved in, has had a stronger conceptual or theoretical focus, trying to map the literature and not looking at effects in the real world, so to say. Campoisen and colleagues, they are indeed also looking at effects to a certain extent, but they are also putting quite a lot of effort into identifying two main bodies of research. And again, here you see trying to map the literature and the boundaries within it and towards other fields. And then you have the third contribution here by Kotsiu and colleagues, where they are quite an ambitious study looking at the conceptualization of future skills and try to develop meta categories on the basis of the literature to bring some order into the way that we think about future skills, because there's a huge mass of different concepts, different notions, different categories related to the notion of future skills. So they try to bring some order into that by doing a scoping review. So that's 3 different reviews. And it's absolutely crucial to point out that these reviews are not trying to be exhaustive of the literature, not trying to map the entire literature like systematic aggregative reviews we typically do when you're trying to look at the effectiveness of policy interventions. But they are trying to map a substantial part of the literature. And I think that's highly relevant to think about as a student as well. Not necessarily being involved in mapping the totality, the entire literature, but to pick up, to select, to identify parts, a substantial part of the literature, and focus on that. That's realistic, I believe, for us as researchers and for students within a more limited time space. And we can discuss that as well. Which leads me to the question, which I think many of you will also be asking yourselves. And I continue to ask myself these questions, by the way. How comprehensive is a scoping review? How much literature should be included? How much time and effort? Preparing for this talk, I tried to think about these quite vital questions. We are working within time pressure. We have to be realistic and to a certain extent also, of course, pragmatic about what we do. And I would say it depends on your research interest, how sharply defined it is. The scoping review that I'm going to present in a few minutes, we used 3 years for it effectively altogether by doing the scoping review and the analysis involved and the publication of it. So that was quite a big scoping review. But I've been involved in other scoping reviews that have taken only a few months with a much more sharper focus. So it depends on how broad your research interest is. That's absolutely fundamental to keep in mind. And again, remember that scoping reviews are not trying to be exhaustive of the entire literature on a given topic. At the same time, I would argue that a scoping review has a value on its own. Sometimes you see, especially those maybe writing in medical research or in health research, that a scoping review is a preparation for undertaking a systematic aggregative reviews that is trying to measure or find out, identify the effectiveness of policy interventions. So that it's this sort of a preliminary assessment of a field before you get to answering the really important questions. And I would argue that within our field in education, I'm not able to say how it really in health and medical research, but I would certainly say when it comes to our field of education, a scoping review certainly has a value on its own, and that it can help you to ask more precise, more sharper, more critical questions. And like all good research, yes, it raises further questions. And that is part of the point of scoping reviews. Okay, so I will take a deep breath and before I'm going to focus for the next 10, 15 minutes or so on the scoping review that I have been involved in along with Sorensen and Dumay and the team we had in UC in Belgium, part of this Teachers Careers project. And you have the reference here, and I very much recommend you to look further into this reference, this article, to read more in more detail about how we actually conducted this literature review. But I'll give you some pointers here during the next 15 minutes or so. Absolutely fundamental to keep in mind that if you think about scoping reviews, you should think about, for starters, okay, what is really your research interest and what are your objectives? And what is the best means for you to designing your scoping review, keeping that review objective in mind? And that's what we try to do. And for this review that I'm going to talk about. So again, patterns. We were looking into a specific research literature about teachers in international and global contexts. We were interested in globalization theory. We were interested in the use of globalization theory in that literature on teachers in the context of globalization and internationalization. And we were interested in how a theory is being used in the literature. Are these issues theorized at all, and to what extent, and with what theories? And what are the blind spots in the literature? So there you see, we were not interested in policy, let's say, in measuring the effectiveness of policy interventions. We were interested in the research literature. And this formed part of the beginning of the project, of the Teachers Careers project. And it was useful in this way because it helped us to define, to sharpen our questions before the empirical work. Here you have the website profile of this article that I'm going to talk about. And why I'm showing this? Well, I'm showing this because you see that there is a tab with supplemental material. And I encourage you to look into that if you'd like to read more about this particular review. The supplemental material Appendix A. And I'm going to draw on that when I'm going to talk about the scoping review we did as part of this project. And it looks like this. It's just a Word file, but it designs our search strategy, our screening procedure, and our coding strategy. So there you'll be able to read in more detail about what we did at different stages, but I will, over the next minutes, offer some reflections about these processes. Here are some useful terms that are also included in our article. The purpose of our scoping review was, again, identifying patterns. In this way, a so-called configurative review. It was also conceptual because we were interested especially in the use of theory. And it offered a particular take of a systematic review because we were going through particular stages, not with the purpose of identifying the effectiveness of policy interventions, but to explain in quite some detail and trying to be transparent about the decisions that we made as part of this review. And again, we were not trying to be exhaustive about all the literature about this topic, but we wanted to look into a substantial part of it. I think these stages are useful. There are a bunch of different outlines, different stages being offered in the literature. For our review, we were inspired by this way of putting the stages of systematic literature reviews, but also relevant for scoping literature reviews. And I'm going to focus on the stages 3 to 6. But here you see 10 stages. And again, it is certainly not a checklist. It is not a matter of ticking off boxes. Each of these stages offers opportunities for reflection, for decision making, for skilled judgment. So, to give you a bit of time to take in these different stages, and you have the reference here from Gao and Oliver and Thomas, 2013, but also Pettigrew and Roberts, another very much cited reference about literature reviews, systematic reviews. So you start from the need. You have a review question, or let's say a research question for your review. And then you start considering what is the scope of your review, the inclusion criteria of the literature, the design of a search strategy, and I'll go into detail with this, the screening of the literature that you identify to see what is the most relevant to include in your review, the coding of that literature that you have screened, that you have found relevant, and then you move into, let's say, the analysis. Coding is, of course, also part of the analysis, but let's say a discussion of the literature that you have screened as relevant to include in your review. And then, of course, you should communicate your findings, whether in articles, whether in essays, whether in dissertations. So these are the stages that we were inspired by. And as I said, each of these stages require decisions and skilled judgment. And that's your place to shine. And I'll come back to that also in the summary of this talk. You are in charge. As a researcher, as a student, there is plenty of space for you to demonstrate your skilled judgment. And this is what makes it exciting. For our review that I'm talking about, teachers and teaching in the context of globalization, we started out with our research objective, and then we identified 4 dimensions that we think, okay, what is it that we're interested in when it comes to this literature? We had the social dimension, a work dimension, the political dimension, and a so-called scalar dimension or spatial dimension, because we're interested in globalization, in processes that goes beyond national borders, so to say. We're interested in teachers as a specific social group. We're interested in their work and their practices, but as it happens, also their education and their qualifications. We're interested in the governance and the policy processes related to teachers and teaching. And we're interested in the geographical spaces that would go across national borders. These 4 dimensions, let's say this is our way of trying to break down our review objective and see, okay, going into more detail to see what is it really we're interested in. And that proved absolutely fundamental for the next stages. If we go back here, we are at stage 2, trying to break down the review question. And that proved extremely important for the next stages. It had implications, direct implications for how we undertook the rest of our review. Search strategy, screening, coding, and so on. So what did we include and what did we exclude? There are a bunch of choices here. We wanted to, in our scoping review, and this is just an example, obviously. So keep in mind, it's just an example. It depends on your review objective. So we were interested in literature that to some extent mentioned teachers and teaching in the context of globalization. And we wanted that to be mentioned explicitly in the literature that we were going to analyze. So this means that we were excluding a lot of literature that we know, for example, the literature in econometrics, the economics of education, that have been very influential in policy processes globally. but they do not theorize or really consider. They're not very interested in the topics that we are interested in our scoping review, so we excluded them. They should not be part of our review. That was a basic inclusion-exclusion criteria for us. Then we also excluded the so-called gray literature. And this is something to consider very carefully. Are you going to exclude reports from the OECD or from UNESCO and so on, bunch of state authorities that can be extremely useful research? We excluded it for our review because we are interested in research debates. So we gave priority to articles in academic journals, book contributions issued by publishing houses. So a rather strict concept of peer-reviewed literature, you can say. Yeah, that's the choice we made. Language, absolutely fundamental to consider. What languages are we going to focus on? We decided, for pragmatic reasons, to focus on the anglophone literature. That very often happens due to the status of English as a global language of research, the most dominant language of research. That comes with some shortcomings, certainly. There are certainly many researchers calling for including literature in different languages. And that would be extremely relevant. It would also be relevant for us. But I'm from Denmark. I could also understand the Nordic languages and try to analyze literature in those languages. My colleague Xavier Dumay from Belgium, a francophone speaker, he could have understand or could also have considered literature in French. But we decided in the end to focus on the anglophone literature. Because we will find it hard to justify why should we include just a few other languages. So yeah, that's a lot of consideration went into that. And that's also something for you to consider as students, that there might very well be important contributions in other languages that you know, and that is worth considering. Okay. Search strategy. This is extremely interesting. What we did, and thinking about the search strategy is absolutely fundamental for when you conduct literature reviews. What we did was we did not just rely on electronic databases, because we knew that electronic databases only covers parts of the literature. So we also identified some key contributions that we knew that they are there in the field. And we also looked into bibliographies, or the list of references, basically, of different reviews that had already been published. Then we compiled those list of references and considered those as part of our literature review. They went into the pool of literature that we screened. So we have three components: purposive sampling, based on our knowledge of the field; hand search, as it's called, where we looked at list of references, compiled those, included those in the screening; and then also electronic databases, where we chose 2 different databases. And again, this was quite a big review that took several years. But my point here is to say that, okay, putting some consideration into how do you search for literature? Can you explain that? That's a good thing if you can. It shows that you're reflexive, that you have some kind of critical awareness about how to search for literature and how to engage with it. 2 key concepts there is sensitivity and specificity, where higher degrees of sensitivity tend to lower the specificity of the search. The sensitivity, when you design your search strategy, relates to the proportion of all studies retrieved by the search. And then the specificity relates to the relevance of those studies that you have found. And again, there are some very practical considerations to consider when you design your research or your search strategy. So for students and for researchers, how would you balance the purposive sampling, the hand search, and then the use of electronic databases? Should you just rely on one or more components? Very relevant question. Extremely interesting to consider what are the content selection policies of electronic databases, not only of ERIC and Scopus, but also for others. And what do these selection policies mean for if you should consider other search components? In the appendix to our article, the Appendix A, which is available online, as I mentioned earlier, you will see some detail about the search strings that we used or we designed by trial and error in the ERIC and Scopus databases. And again, the search strategy had multiple implications for the way that we analyze the literature, because we were interested also in books that are not privileged often in electronic databases, but we knew that there were important books in the field. We wanted to include them, but we didn't have them in a file that could be read digitally. So we read them in the old-fashioned way. That put some limitations on the way that we could analyze what was actually in the books, because we didn't have them in a PDF format, for example. So your search strategy will have direct implications for how can you analyze the literature, how can you search for certain terms, and so on. Okay, screening. So we identified in our scoping review 990 references, and this is quite a lot. And then we screened them using those 4 dimensions that I mentioned, that define the scope of our review, that I mentioned earlier. We found it necessary to develop more nuance criteria to screen them, to find out what is relevant, what is not relevant to include in our research or in our review. Since the literature was peer-reviewed, based on this strict notion of peer review that we had included as the basis of our review, we did not do any quality screening. We did not consider the validity of the findings included in the literature that we screened. And as you can see here, we included a number of different types of studies. And that meant then that we removed a lot of the literature from our pool, and we ended up with 279 pieces of literature. And again, this is quite a lot, and too much, obviously, for a dissertation or for coursework for students. That is quite obvious. But just to indicate the process that we went through. And it is now becoming very common to include a so-called Prisma flow diagram in articles and other publications when you have done a scoping review or other types of reviews. And here you see, and this is also included in the article, so you can look in more detail there, what this meant, or let's say, how the numbers developed over the screening. Now we're coming into more detail about our scoping review, and I will not go into too much detail because the focus of this talk is how to conduct literature reviews and not teachers and teaching in the context of globalization. But just to say that we had 2 coding steps. First, we did a quite descriptive coding of the 279 pieces of literature. And then on the basis of that, we developed a numbers-based coding system, different types of studies, different key topics, different clusters of theory that we developed. Let's say we developed those clusters. We came up with these categorizations. And also the coding step 2 related to the use of methodology and data. So there was a quite descriptive step to our literature review. And then on the basis of that, we developed these categories that helped us to analyze the literature in more detail. And this is actually the same, just in a different format. And you see the table is included in our article for those of you who want to look more into that. So, selected review findings. We could look into the development of the literature over time. We could see, and actually that corresponded with what we thought on beforehand, but now we had much more substance to our argument, so to say, yeah, it has increased in all sorts of ways, especially over the past two decades. The literature has expanded a lot. We identified these 6 key topics, and that is already a finding from our scoping review. And we could also see for which topics the literature has expanded more or less. For some topics, it has actually declined a bit. We could also look at the use of theory, and we could, based on the literature, we could discuss the epistemic gains, so to say, what can different theories be used to explain, and what are the blind spots in the literature. And we could also point out what proportion of the studies that we have included in our review did not theorize globalization at all. And we see that as a major problem as scholars, that globalization was not theorized in a large part of the literature. Finally, we could demonstrate, based on our scoping review, that a huge geographical bias towards a Western outlook in the literature and in the way that we think about globalization when it comes to teachers and teaching. So here you see again from the article, so I won't go into much detail about that. Yeah, the development in the uses in the focus on topics related to teachers. The geographical bias, some systems being much more addressed in the literature, large parts of the world completely absent, but a bunch of other systems are mentioned, are analyzed to some extent. We could also look into the use of theory, in addressing different teacher key topics. But again, this goes into quite a lot of detail with the findings, and that is not really the objective of this talk. But yes, we could do this cross-tabulation of the use of globalization theory in addressing different topics related to teachers. You can read more about this in the article if you want to. Okay, to finish off, 2 more minutes. This was an example of a scoping review. Quite big, quite large, much larger than students would be asked to do, certainly. Would be possible for them to do as part of a dissertation or as part of their coursework. But there are important points to take, I believe. The importance of skilled judgment. Always considering how can you explain your choices? And often it's not so easy. There are so many assumptions that we make. But trying to explain, what are you doing? And often when I have been marking student assignments, and often when I read research articles, these choices are not explained in much detail very often. Always keep your research interest and your research questions in mind. Let them guide you. Explain your choices, and there's this excitement and comfort of knowing you're the one in charge. It is not a matter of ticking off a very long checklist. How are scoping reviews relevant for students? So this was a challenge for me to come up with, but I think it's a very useful challenge, and we can consider this in more detail and discuss it in more detail. General lessons for postgraduate coursework, for example. This sort of setting the scene literature reviews that you also see in many research articles, they also involve numerous decisions. Can you explain those How did you search for literature? Was it by drawing on literature that was key readings in the course? Did you complement that with searching in databases? Explaining that is a very good thing. It helps you to demonstrate a critical awareness, and being conscious and aware of these decisions, I believe, helps you to ask better and more critical questions about your research topic. Of course, always consider the assignment format. I know that varies hugely across different courses. What is the scope for conducting literature reviews in your assignment? Absolutely critical, of course, to consider. Finally, dissertation work. What is the scope for undertaking scoping reviews as part of your dissertation work? We could ask, well, talk with your supervisor first of all, of course. But in general, I would say doing a scoping review will give you possibilities to demonstrate this critical awareness that I mentioned before, also generally about coursework, the meaningful decision-making on your part to engage with the literature. You'll be better able to situate your contribution in the literature by undertaking a scoping review. By mapping and tracing research debates, treating literature as data, so to say. Inner quantitative, by counting, for example, but also qualitative by discussing the key topics, the key debates in the literature. And I think that a scoping review could fill parts of your dissertation, or it could fill all of it. Depends on your interest. I could imagine a scoping review informing the first part of our dissertation that is focused on a policy analysis, for example. So a short scoping review, or a rather small scoping review, but very focused, that could then inform the way that you analyze a specific policy. In this way, combining a scoping review with empirical work, where you analyze a policy, for example. But at the same time, a scoping review can also be a very large project, and it could also take up your entire dissertation, I would argue. That's it for me. And now we have a bit of time for Q&A, and looking forward to your questions. So I will stop sharing. And I say, thanks for your time. You're welcome to reach out to me for comments, for feedback, and for further questions. I hope this all made sense. Thank you.